So today what I'd like to do is to talk to you about our work on long-term history of segregation in Baltimore and how segregation ends up being an important story for us to understand the social and ecological dynamics of the history of Baltimore, and perhaps to think about it in other places as well. I use the term a Janus view to refer to the Roman god Janus, who was able to look both to the past and to the future at the same time, which is the reason that we have the month January called January, because it's the transition from one year to another. And one of the reasons that I purposefully do that is not just to sound fancy and use an obscure reference, but also because what we really do seek to do is to understand the past in order to think about and understand the future. Also because without understanding the past, it's very hard to think instrumentally about how we will progress into the future. So we start with a mystery. And this mystery involves polluting industries in the city of Baltimore, as also where we have trees, canopy cover, and where we have parks in the city of Baltimore. So let's start with polluting industries. One of the first pieces of research that we did when we started the Baltimore ecosystem study was to think about where do we have polluting industries. And we used a database that had been produced by the Environmental Protection Agency called TRI, or Toxic Release Inventory. That database requires all industries in the United States to publish what pollution they emit into the atmosphere and whether or not it exceeds what is legally allowed. We took that toxic release inventory and we mapped out where all those locations were. Then we mapped out where we found dominantly white neighborhoods and predominantly black neighborhoods. And for your reference, Baltimore is pretty much a black and white neighborhood. Black and white city, so it's about 60% African American and 40% white. And what we find is that those places where we had the TRI sites, where we had those polluting industries, were also predominantly surrounded by white neighborhoods, which doesn't make any sense if you go by the typical environmental justice literature. So puzzling as to why that would happen. And you see here on the right showing those distances, and you can see that the white populations live much closer to those polluting industries than those black neighborhoods over time. The second was canopy cover and parks. And when you look at environmental justice literature and you look at predictors of where do you find vegetation, what you typically see is that African American neighborhoods are not associated, so they're negatively associated with where do you have trees, meaning that where you have African American neighborhoods, you typically do not find trees. Similarly with parks, that you would not find parks in those neighborhoods where you have African American neighborhoods. In contrast, in the city of Baltimore, we found different results. We started to look at characterizing neighborhoods, and we used a software or data set called Tapestry, which is the fancy phrase for it is geodemographic market segmentation, which basically means combining social, economic, housing data, and so on to market things to you. So I'll use American references. So if they want to know where to put the Starbucks, they use that data. So it's marketing data that's geographically based to figure out where to sell you things. We use the same database, and the notion is that it's not just income and education, it's not just race, but it's also things like your life stage. Do you have kids? Don't you have kids? In terms of where you will live, and what are the environmental conditions that you will find in those places. So as an example, my father and I, he makes more money than I do. I have a little bit more education than he does, and we try not to focus on that. Like, more education you get, the less your income is. But the notion is that we're kind of similar, right? In terms of income, education, race, and so on. But he is managing his lawn to do as little as possible. I am managing my lawn so that my kids can run around and go crazy and do lots of stuff. And so those life stage characteristics should be predictors about where you choose to live and what those environmental conditions are, what you'll consume. And when we did that research, we found that that kind of market set of variables, when combined, far better predicted where we have vegetation than just looking at income and education and race alone. But the thing that we also found was that those neighborhoods that had trees were also positively associated with African American populations. Doesn't make sense. Chris Boone did some additional work looking at parks. What we found was that those places that had the most number of parks were also African American neighborhoods. Whites were associated with larger parks, but blacks were associated with more frequent examples of where we had parks. So we have those two mysteries that completely run against the narrative that we have about environmental justice. And so we kind of said, well, the data is what it is, and we could stop speculating as to why that happens, or we could choose to try to investigate that further. Now, we're a long-term ecological research site, which means two things. One of which is that we collect certain kinds of data over the long term, but we also try to recreate the historical data in order to understand what those long-term phenomenon are. And it was because we had that long-term perspective that we started to solve this mystery. Now, in order to do this, required a lot of data to come together. I sort of found a label for it when I was reading Johann's dissertation when he talks about empirical groundedness and epistemological flexibility or adaptiveness, because that's what was required when we wanted to start to tease this together. And it required us pulling together legal documents, government records, neighborhood minutes, purchasing data, zoning variances, property data, and newspaper articles, all to understand what had happened. But we also needed some detective tools. And what we were interested here was in what is the bias, if there is one, in amenities and disamenities, but we're also interested in patterns and procedures, the processes. And so environmental justice can relate to not only what are the outcomes, but how did those outcomes occur? And that legacies and these changing perceptions of what people think is good about the environment may change over a 100-year period of time. So this was a way to start to organize and put together the evidence to make the case for what we learned. And the other was this idea of dynamic heterogeneity. And some people may not like this dynamic heterogeneity diagram because they argue that it may be tautological in its explanation. The basic question that we ask him, though, in our long-term work is how does past heterogeneities affect the current heterogeneities? Meaning, how does the past and the spatial distribution of things affect decisions that then affect things in the next time series? And then it unravels or does what we, again, American thing, does a slinky, little kid's toy, slinkies, over time. And also, how the investments or the disinvestments made in one neighborhood, how is it the result of thinking about all the other neighborhoods at the same time? So it's not just thinking about your neighborhood in isolation. Decisions are made about where you live based upon all the other neighborhoods at the same time. So there's this concern for the mosaic of the landscape that you're looking at that affects those decisions. So I'm going to present some evidence to you. You can tell me whether or not you think we've solved the mystery. We first start with two major changes or things that happen. Well, there are really three major things that happen in Baltimore. After the Civil War in the United States between the Confederate and the Union forces, there was a period of what was called Reconstruction. And the decision was made by the Union forces and by the northern states that they would not punish the Confederate states for trying to secede, but they would actually rebuild. And that's what's called the period of Reconstruction. Also that happened during the period of Reconstruction was that African Americans were given the right to vote and the right to own property. At that time, cities like Baltimore and Louisville and lots of other cities were very mixed in terms of where people lived. As time went on and there was a struggle to assert power in the late 1800s, there was this segregation that began. And people were forced to be able to live in one place or not another place, and there was a real separation in power. So that was the first phase of the reordering of the spatial structure of cities in the United States. Cities like Baltimore were the first cities to start to put in segregationist ordinances. They actually took it all the way to the Supreme Court where they lost. And it was against the amendments to the US Constitution that said that it was illegal to make these decisions based upon race. So you had these, what were these de jure efforts at determining where people could live that were found unconstitutional, and then various forces started to enact what we would call de facto, not enforceable by law, but enforced by custom and rules by which where people could live. And that's what you start to see start to unfold in Baltimore. And one of the sort of signature moments where that happens is during what's called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or redlining activities that occurred that were financed by the federal government. Are people, well, I'll just assume people aren't familiar with the term redlining. What happened, so there have been two major collapses of the housing market in the United States. One was 5 years ago, and the other was in the early 1930s. In the early 1930s, the decision was that the federal government would come and would intervene and would help people who could not afford their house any longer, to help them refinance and to give them mortgages and to upgrade those homes, or to just enable them to pay out. But what they did was they went and they characterized, federal government employees, the Homeowners Loan Corporation went out and characterized every single neighborhood in terms of whether or not it was a good investment. Those neighborhoods that were seen as not being a good investment were redlined, saying that we are not going to put money into those neighborhoods. One of the bases for whether or not a neighborhood was redlined was whether or not it had African Americans living there, or Italians, or Irish. So it was if you're black or if you're Catholic, was really the basis for those decisions. So that redlining started profound markers in what happened in the city. And what our research did was to sort of look at how that redlining affected what was done in the city. And there were some different ways that we did it. One of which was we pulled every single zoning variance application in the city of Baltimore for the entire history of Baltimore. So zoning started in 1928, and we pulled every single zoning variance. We mapped where it was, we mapped it to the neighborhoods, and then we pulled the case law of every single one. And what you see is that there was a huge bias in terms of where they were approved, predominantly in African American neighborhoods, and where they were disapproved, predominantly in white neighborhoods. Even in cases where that industry, that business, was owned by a white owner and the clients were white. They were still approved in African American neighborhoods and disapproved in white neighborhoods. That started a sequence of events such that those neighborhoods that were redlined, they didn't have the investments in order to improve those areas, and they began to decline and stay in a very low quality. If you take a look at what the value of those homes were in 1935, and you look at what the value of those homes are today, you adjust for inflation, the value of those homes have not increased in value in that entire time. In 90 years, they've not increased in value during that entire time, which is a big problem in the United States, where your main source of wealth, your main source of financial planning is in your home. And so if I was to say to you, if you give me $100 today, adjusting for inflation, I will give you $100 in 90 years, you're not going to invest with me. But that's what those neighborhoods faced. And in doing so, it started to set a sequence of affecting where decisions were made in terms of where people could live. So those people who lived in those red lines didn't have access to capital. They were unable to move. But there are also other forces in terms of what were put into deeds, saying that you were not allowed to sell your home to an African American or Jew at that time. If you buy a house in Baltimore, it'll still be on your deed. It's just not enforceable in those places. It also played out where you had your parks, this redlining. One of the major, and so it plays out in three different kinds of things. We'll talk about golf courses, but golf courses swimming pools and beaches and playgrounds were some of the areas that were contested, that were associated with this segregation and exclusion. In the case of the golf courses, starting in 1938, the African-American Baltimore golf group wanted to be able to play at the golf courses that already existed. And they were excluded from being able to do that because those golf courses were for whites only. And they took it to court, and the courts said, you can't have this racial bias. You have to allow them to play somewhere. And so they were allowed to play at Carroll Park, which is on the southwest side. Now, Carroll Park, as you know, golf, well, most of you know, golfing is 18 holes, but Carroll Park only had 9 holes. And it was the least quality of all of the golf courses, short fairways, and just wasn't very well kept up. And so the Baltimore African-American golf group went back to court and said, it's not equal. You know, and at that time the law was you could have separate but equal, and they took it to court, and what the golf company had to say was, or the whites had to say was, well, do we want to be racist, or are we cheap? Because what the courts were saying to them was, you have to invest in the same amount of money, you have to make it 18 holes, and you have to improve the quality of it. And that was going back and forth and back and forth. The white neighborhoods that surrounded the golf course were very upset that you might allow whites to play there, not only because of the separation of blacks and whites in terms of recreation, but also the notion was once blacks start playing at this white golf course, then they'll want to start to live nearby it, and they'll want to start to move into those white neighborhoods. And so there was this real concern about the invasion that might play out. And so the recreation itself cannot be understood as one of isolated only on the recreation, but also the effects it would have on those neighborhoods. And so this went back and forth and back and forth, and the Department of Recreation says, well, we have to follow the law, and then they would follow the law, and then the neighborhoods would appeal to the mayor, and then they'd have to reverse things, and back and forth and back and forth. And finally, at the end of the day, they decided they were more cheap than they were racist. And so they decided they wouldn't fix up the golf course and really allow the African Americans to play at the other golf courses that had the same quality of work that was in there. The second piece to this is that when we start to think about not only that history of exclusion, of keeping people out of those resources and the fear of invasion and the way that people would move, is this idea of legacies and feedbacks, of disamenities and lags. And what we started to see too, when we started to now, in that case we're looking at parks, now when we turn our attention to trees and we turn our attention to vacant lots, so on the vacant lots thing, Baltimore, population of about 620,000 people. We have 18,000 vacant homes, about 18,000 vacant lots that we know of. We suspect that we really have about 40,000 vacant homes and probably about 20,000 vacant lots. When I take those data on vacant homes and vacant lots, which are the black dots, and I plot them out today, 2017, versus 1935, there's a pretty good match between where I have those vacant lots and where I have the redlining. Now going to the tree piece, there are two pieces to it. One of which is that when I don't have the slide here, when I map out where do I have the most canopy cover, or where do I have the lowest canopy cover, it matches perfectly with the redlining. Okay, so I got that part. But still I have that number where I said, when I did the statistical relationships, and I looked at where do I, about African Americans and where do I have canopy cover, that was a positive relationship. So then when we start to investigate even further, what it turns out is that we're dealing with what we call inherited landscapes. Meaning as the next sequence under urban renewal was that we had whites moving out of the city, often through federal subsidized housing out in the county, them moving out. Now African Americans have more choice as to where they live, and they move into those white neighborhoods. So what they do is they inherit two things, one of which is now they inherit all those white parks. right? So that starts to explain that. The other thing is that they start to inherit all of those trees that were planted. And when we look at the neighborhood association minutes of 1920, you see those neighborhood, and it's really amazing what they say in these neighborhood minutes about a variety of things and how they're going to keep people from being able to move in, and ultimately how it won't work. But one of the things that they do is they put up the money to hire the first city forester in 1920, and how they're advocating for trees. With the movement of people, whites out of those neighborhoods and the African Americans moving in, they inherit those landscapes. And so that explains why we have those trees in those places. So while we have an outcome, a positive outcome in terms of environmental justice in African Americans and parks and trees, the means by which it happened are also unfairly realized. Going to the polluting industries, which was the other kind of mystery that I mentioned, the reason that those industries were associated primarily with white neighborhoods was that people wanted to live close to work. And so the African Americans were precluded from being able to live close to work, so they were kept away from the polluting industries. So again, here's why we start to see this long-term history of how segregation plays out, and this idea that there are these long-term legacies that exist. In terms of the lags, we have different rates of change of these social ecological systems that are important to pay attention to, in the sense that the neighborhoods are changing much more quickly than the trees, right? So the trees are a legacy, they're a lag, and it'll take time, if there is a relationship, for how those trees may better reflect, if they do, the characteristics of those neighborhoods. So we have these legacies of segregation, of the redlining that plays out. It then appears again in urban renewal, where the investments are made in white neighborhoods in order to plant trees that are still observable today, as well as the lags and the differences and the changes of those social and ecological changes that occur. So what we start to see, going back to the slinky, is that we have these patterns of dynamic heterogeneity that starts to occur, where we had locational choices in housing markets. And when I say locational choices, they're choices, but some have choices and some don't, right? So you have locational choices in housing markets manifest as residential segregation that affects where you have disamenities and amenities that affect the ecological structure, that then affects where do we have new public and private investments over time as we face urban renewal. Now this also then starts to go to governance networks and thinking about, throughout this whole time we have governance networks, right? Because we see those neighborhood associations advocating in 1920 for investments to be made where they live. And so there's this long term of governance networks that are now changing and starting to realize that there are these inequities, and that the question is, how is that going to play out in terms of the practice that we take on, that then affects where do we make those prioritizations in terms of sustainability, investments, and implementation, or in terms of those ecosystem services and those bundles, and where are we going to make those investments, and who wants things, differences in uses and preferences that play out that can then also turn to community development. So this is kind of looking forward in terms of what we now have to address. And those governance networks need to think about not only what are the outcomes, but what is the process by which those things are achieved. And I'm not sitting here as a smart scientist saying I know what the answers are, because I really don't know what the answers are. And I think that even with this, I don't think that we're fully grappling with what the challenges are that we face. And so I'd like to summarize this, but then pivot to thinking about looking forward in terms of where we're going. First of all, in urban ecology, and I'm going to conflate northern ecology of Europe and North America with urban ecology for the world, which is of course not the right answer, okay? But what typically we have looked at is to assume landscapes of choice, that people can choose where they live, and that the landscape reflects those choices being made. We haven't really grappled with what happens when people don't have a choice about where to live, and their access to markets and capital and transportation and that whole host of things. So, what I would say is we need to start to rethink what urban ecology is, and that it's not just landscapes of choice, which economists, it's a fundamental point of economists, is you have equal access to capital, equal access to decisions, equal access to knowledge, and so therefore the market reflects everyone being able to equally exercise those things. We have landscapes that don't do that. When we look at the landscape today, we also have to realize that there may be inherited landscapes, that we may have these legacies that are at play, and that we need to not only understand the system as all the parts connecting, but we need to understand the spatial and the temporal explanations that may be needed to understand what that ecological system is, and that it may have a long history. And that including those explanations into urban ecological frameworks is going to be challenging, and it's going to require things like dynamic heterogeneity to understand how time A as a spatial pattern and processes then explain time B, but all those changes aren't instantaneous. Some of those patches or things will change at slower rates. So this is going to be challenging. And this is what we started to realize when we focused on this idea of having this mystery that what we would expect to find in Baltimore wasn't there. And that we needed new tools and new sets of data, and feeling comfortable bringing different kinds of data, bringing together different kinds of perspectives to understand what was going on was necessary in order to explain what we see today. But it also makes us kind of nervous about thinking about what's going to be the future. And one of the reasons for that is we have these challenges that remain. It's not just enough to explain, but it's also more knowledge is needed to fix things than to just understand things, I think, if that makes sense. And what we're starting to realize, and if, the first paragraph of every urban ecological paper that you read is, cities are human-dominated ecosystems. And it's like, yeah, okay, I'm just going to skip to the second paragraph and get through all that. But I think that one of the key things is, to be able to talk about is, some people dominate human ecosystems more than others. And some people dominate other social groups more than others. So that's part of the challenge of what we have to face. Second is that segregation remains highly resilient. I mean, the fact that we see this still on the landscape 90 years later is kind of frightening, right? It is a highly resilient system, and what makes it so resilient, I think, is something that we need to start to wrap our minds around, and how would you try to understand it as a resilient system? And how would you try to understand it as, well, how do we start to untangle this, if society wants to untangle it? I'm not going to make any assumptions that people want to untangle it. If they do, how would you do it? And how is this relevant nationally, not just Baltimore, but to other cities in the US? And how is this relevant internationally? If I go to any post-colonial city in the world, will I find some kinds of vestiges of the same phenomenon? Maybe yes, maybe no. I think that's where we need to start to pursue things. But in doing so, there's a lot of parts to this that we have to understand. You don't have the luxury of saying, well, I'm just going to look at society and environment. There's all these other social parts that are reinforcing this. And so it's access to capital with redlining. It's access to markets. Where can you buy? Where can you sell? It's related to housing, education, transportation. It's related to public health. One of the things that was used as a basis for justifying segregation was the prevalence of tuberculosis, and saying we need to quarantine these diseases that are the result of high density and keep those people who have it here so that these other people don't get sick. There are other kinds of diseases, particularly things associated with drugs, that we have the same thing now. It plays out in terms of environment, it plays out in terms of power, and importantly, I think it plays out in terms of identity and the stories that we tell about people and places, and maybe that's the hardest thing there is to unravel in all of this. And so I think that what we find ourselves in Baltimore is embarking upon a new research agenda for where we go. We'll continue to do the other stuff and choices and things, but we need to start to think about what are some of the next steps of where we want to go. And in doing so, these aren't two straw men. It's the notion of how does work in urban ecology have a conversation with a phenomenal amount of wonderful work on segregation? How do they start to have conversations and inform each other? And I think that urban ecology, which is a newer science than the work that's done on segregation, has to treat with some respect all of that work that's been done on segregation and not just act like, hey, we discovered this, we're going to fix it, right? But to think about what are the tools that we bring to thinking about segregation. And I think that some of the key things from urban ecology that we can bring is one of organizational complexity, which is understanding how all those parts come together, how they work at different scales. The second is this idea of spatial complexity or heterogeneity, understanding the influences of if people are allowed to play at this golf course, what does that mean for the neighborhoods that are next to it? Or if you concentrate all of a certain group of people together in a confined space, what does that mean for things? As well as the temporal complexity of legacies and lags and slowly emerging phenomenon. So bringing together those ways that we can, and the tools that we can bring to think about those systems, but also to bring together the ecological phenomenon. So understanding how does the urban heat island affect those concentrated poverty and redline neighborhoods? How does it affect stormwater runoff? How does it affect where you have rats and where you don't have rats? How does it affect things like Zika and who is going to be most vulnerable? How does it affect who's going to be most susceptible to hurricanes or wildfires? So bringing together those things, and then also starting to think through what are the practical applications of how do we do this. And here, it's not that we're going to come up with ecological solutions to segregation, but how does ecological thinking come to understand segregation? Now, on the other hand, what does segregation contribute to urban ecology? One is that segregation, it's emerging, is a phenomenal way to illustrate the full force of thinking about urban ecology. Like, it's the poster child of thinking about urban ecology. It's a poster child that we're uncomfortable with. It's a poster child that ecologists are really uncomfortable with. But it really exhibits all those phenomenon that we say are key aspects of urban ecology. Second is for us to think about segregation as a synthetic urban ecological theory, that we may actually be able to understand segregation as a new way or a theoretical way of urban ecology. When we were playing around with what were we going to call this, we were going to talk about, we said, well, maybe it's the integrated theory of segregation. And then we're like, well, that's awkward. Or we said, what about the unified theory of segregation? And it was like, well, that is awkward too. So we're going to go with synthetic theory of segregation. And then, and I think I'm in the right place to bring this up. Hopefully you won't abuse me too badly. But is segregation in urban ecology a quintessential example of a social ecological trap? And if it is, or we can play around with that, and maybe there are different kinds of social ecological traps. But if it is, what does that mean for trying to unravel it? What if we have segregation, maybe one kind of social ecological trap in urban ecology, maybe there are others, and then to think about what does it mean to have social ecological traps in urban areas and metropolitan areas if you want to achieve sustainability or resilience? Because you have a highly resilient thing that you maybe don't want that's going to keep you from getting to something that you really do want. And so regardless of whether or not you think segregation is bad, it still may be in the way of, for your own sake, having a more sustainable thing. And so, and here I don't have an answer, and it's here where I'm hoping to launch into a discussion about these things, and about the idea of it as segregation as an illustration of urban ecology. What can urban ecology bring to understanding segregation? And if I was clever enough, I would have put just this idea of a social ecological trap under both urban ecology and under segregation, because I think maybe this is something that we really have to puzzle with and grapple with. When we think about sustainability and resilience, we can be very positive or positivist, like, hey, all these things are solvable, but this is probably going to be really hard to solve. And it also may not be the only one that we have to face. And so with that, I'm going to stop, and hopefully we can have a conversation about not only the first part of segregation as helping understanding it to solve a mystery, but also where do we go from here in thinking about sustainability and resilience. So with that, thank you very much.